In this episode, we're going to talk about our fourth macromolecule. So remember, our macromolecules are proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and fats. So this episode is all about fats. Fats usually get a little bit of a bad rap, but I want to make it clear that fats are absolutely essential to have in our diet and to have in our body. So we use fats for multiple different things. So I'm just going to give you a few examples. We use them in our brain. So our brain is about 60% fat. Cell membranes are made out of a special kind of fat. So we have trillions of cells in our whole body, and that fat barrier is very important for the function of all of our cells. Our heart uses most of its energy from fat. So our heart has to beat for our whole life, and it uses fat primarily for fuel to make that ATP. Our nervous system, so the nerves that communicate information from our body to our brain and vice versa, those neurons many of them are covered with a fat called myelin. Without that insulation layer, our neurons wouldn't be able to transmit information. Our lungs make surfactant. Our digestive system has to absorb fat-soluble nutrients. So if we're not consuming fat with our diet, we won't be able to absorb fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A and vitamin D. Our immune system uses different kinds of fats. I'm going to talk about them actually in a little bit of detail shortly, but our immune system needs to use certain kinds of fatty acids to either increase its immune response or decrease the immune response. So fats have a very important role. So a low fat or no fat diet is not necessarily a good idea. What I want to look at is the structure and the function of the three types of fats. So we're going to look at triglycerides. There are saturated and unsaturated types of triglycerides. Then we're going to look at cholesterol and phospholipids. First, we'll look at triglycerides. These are the fats that we eat. We eat saturated and unsaturated triglycerides, and this is what is under our skin, so our adipose tissue. This is where we store fat. And the whole main function of triglycerides is to give us energy. When we look at a fatty acid, so each of these is a fatty acid. They are composed of carbons and hydrogens. These carbon-hydrogen bonds are what our cells use to produce a whole bunch of energy. In another video, we're going to look at how our cells convert food molecules into our energy molecule, which is ATP. A triglyceride is made up of a glycerol molecule and three fatty acids. Tri means three. The other important thing to note about fats is that they are hydrophobic. In other videos, we've looked at how hydrophobic molecules do not like water, and hydrophilic molecules do. So hydrophilic likes water, hydrophobic does not like water. So if you put oil and water together, the oil is going to stick with itself and the water will stick with itself. This is a very important function when we look at how our cell membranes are composed of fat. It forms a barrier, so this is a very important aspect of fats. So we're going to look at saturated fat and unsaturated fat, and there's some very important distinctions, and we'll compare which ones are going to be good in your diet and which ones are maybe not as good for you to consume, and what those molecules look like. Saturated fats versus unsaturated. Saturated simply means that all of the bonds between the carbons are single bonds. Single bonded carbon molecules are saturated with hydrogen. So there are as many hydrogens as possible on each of these carbon atoms. Carbon always forms 4 bonds. So in a fatty acid chain of a saturated fat, every carbon is connected to another carbon and 2 hydrogens. Saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature, like this butter here, because when we have single bonds between all of the carbons, the molecules can pack closely together. The only difference between a liquid and a solid is how close the molecules are to each other. So in a saturated fat, the chains of fatty acids are close together. They form a solid. And of course, you can heat it and you can melt it. Down here, we have unsaturated fats. Unsaturated fats tend to be the oils. And they are oils because now we are introducing double bonds. When you have a double bond between 2 carbons, now it is not saturated with hydrogen. So carbon can still only bond with 4 things. So this one is bonding with that carbon, that hydrogen, and 2 bonds are going to the next carbon. Now there's no hydrogens down here. This is unsaturated because it is not full of hydrogen. Generally, saturated fats tend to come from animals, and unsaturated fats tend to come from plants. But there's a couple of differences, and we'll look at a food list in a second. When we look at the unsaturated fats, there's good ones and there's not good ones. The whole difference comes in how those double bonds are formed. Remember when we talked about carbohydrates, how we have starch and we have fiber. Both of them are made out of glucose molecules, but we can digest starch and we can't digest fiber. Why? Just because how they bond together means the difference between being able to digest them and not be able to digest them. The same kind of thing is happening with fats. If we look at the double bond of unsaturated fats, there's a very specific way it has to be arranged for our cells to be able to use it. Here we have a cis fatty acid. Cis means that the hydrogens surrounding the double bond are on the same side. This is a cis fatty acid, like olive oil, and it is a good, healthy fat. This is what our cells like to use. Down here, we can see a trans fat. A trans fat is when you have one hydrogen on this side and another hydrogen on the opposite side, making this Z shape. These are bad. We can make trans fats by heating oils. So whenever you're eating your deep fried French fries, you are probably consuming some trans fats, and that is not good for us. The other thing that I want to talk about with unsaturated fat is essential fatty acids. Remember when we talked about proteins, we talked about essential amino acids. We had 9 essential amino acids, and that means we have to get them from our diet. With fats, there are 3 essential fatty acids, so that means we have to get them from our diet. So, alpha-linolenic acid. We also call this one omega-3. Maybe you have heard of it. It is often taken as a supplement. Then we have linoleic acid, and this is omega-6. And we have oleic acid, which is omega-9. These are essential. We have to get them from our diet. All of these are unsaturated fats because you can see that they have double bonds. So, why is omega-3 called omega-3? Simply because the 1, 2, 3, third carbon is where the first double bond is. In omega-6, the first double bond is at the 6th carbon, And omega-9, the first double bond is at the 9th carbon. The other thing that I want to point out is how many double bonds these have. Here in oleic acid, we can see that there's only one double bond. So we call this a mono-unsaturated fatty acid. We often call olive oil a mono-unsaturated fatty acid because it contains a high amount of oleic acid. In omega-3 and omega-6, there's more than one double bond, whether it's 2 or 3 or 5. If there's more than one double bond, we call it a polyunsaturated fatty acid. There are 2 kinds of polyunsaturated fats that are essential and one monounsaturated fat that is essential. Our cells can make all kinds of other fats. We can make triglycerides. We can make the fats that make our cell membranes, all of that. So these ones have to come from our diet. Saturated fats are generally animal fats, and that includes us. Humans are animals, so the fat that we store is generally saturated fat. We're going to find that in meat and eggs and dairy products. But there are 2 plants that have saturated fats, and that would be coconut oil and palm oil. Primarily animal fats, but also 2 plant fats. Unsaturated fats are generally oils. So oils are a slightly bit trickier because they are composed of combinations of different kinds of fats. They are composed of some saturated fat, some unsaturated, and then the unsaturated ones, some of them are monounsaturated fatty acids and some of them are polyunsaturated fatty acids. But generally, these are going to be found in nuts and seeds, corn. We make corn oil, soybean oil, and also fish oil. So fish will have some saturated fats because it is an animal, but fish and seafood also have a high amount of unsaturated fatty acids. I made this chart because I think some of the healthy fats are very interesting to look at. So we know that we need omega-3, 6, and 9 from our diet. Part of the problem, though, is that with our Western diet, we end up getting way more omega-6 compared to omega-3. So often, omega-3 supplements are necessary in some people to make sure that you're getting enough omega-3. So we're going to look at the foods that contain different amounts of omega-3 and 6. The other thing that I want to point out, if we look at the sort of main functions of omega-3, 6, and 9, omega-9 and omega-3 are considered anti-inflammatory. So that means they help to control the immune system so that it's not overreacting. And then omega-6 helps to stimulate the immune system. It is a pro-inflammatory fat. Inflammatory. We want to have a balance of pro-inflammatory that stimulates the immune system. We want the immune system to react to pathogens, but we don't want the immune system to overreact because then we end up with chronic inflammation, and that is associated with all kinds of diseases like heart disease and cancer. So we want to balance omega-3 and omega-6. In this chart, I want to just show you how some oils are composed of different combinations of fatty acids. Coconut oil is 82% saturated fatty acids. That's why we say coconut oil is a saturated fat. It has a small amount of monounsaturated fats, most of which is omega-9, so that's a very healthy fat. Olive oil is much lower in saturated fats, but it has some. There are still some saturated fatty acids in olive oil, but it is primarily monounsaturated fatty acids, and most of those are omega-9. This makes olive oil very healthy. Avocado oil, the same thing. It is primarily a mono unsaturated fatty acid, but it has some saturated fat, lots of omega-9, and then it has some polyunsaturated fats as well. A little bit of omega-3, a little bit of omega-6. Coconut oil, by the way, and other saturated fats don't have any polyunsaturated fatty acids. And then the last example of a good fat is flaxseed oil. There's a tiny bit of saturated fat, a little bit of monounsaturated fat, which is omega-9, and then it's mostly polyunsaturated fats and mostly omega-3. So flaxseed oil has a lot of omega-3. Don't cook this one. These three can be cooked. Olive oil only at low temperatures. Other fats have different proportions of omega-3 and omega-6. So some examples of oils that are high in omega-6, generally we get too many of these in our diet. So generally we're getting too much vegetable oils like corn oil, soybean oil, cottonseed oil. Those kinds of fats are very, very high in omega-6. I want to focus a little bit more on the unhealthy oils. Trans fats. I talked about these in the previous slide. Trans fats, when you have your double bonded carbon in your fatty acid chain, if you have a hydrogen on one side of one carbon and the other side of the other carbon, this is a trans fat. Our cells do not like to use trans fats. And sometimes we produce trans fats using this process called hydrogenation. If you've ever eaten margarine, which you shouldn't, then you have eaten trans fat. So hydrogenation means that they're adding hydrogens to the double bonds to try to make liquid oils into a semi-solid so you can spread it on toast. And in the process, it is often an incomplete process, and we end up producing these trans fats, which are unhealthy fats. You want to avoid trans fats. Read your food label ingredients. The other thing that we want to look out for is refined and processed oils. They go through a whole bunch of chemical reactions that has an impact on our double bonds. When we have double bonds, they're very unstable. So a single bonded carbons in our saturated fatty acids, these are much more stable. Things like coconut oil or butter or lard even, they're going to be more stable. You can actually, it's better to cook with those because they don't have the delicate double bonds. When we have double bonds, they can be damaged by things like light. That's why often good olive oil is in a dark bottle. By air, so oxygen can oxidize double bonds, and heat. So cooking or refining and processing oils can damage these double bonds. We don't want to oxidize or convert these into trans fats because these are bad. So we've talked about triglycerides. So they're sort of the biggest category of fats, the saturated, unsaturated, the cis versus the trans, the essential fatty acids, and then where do they come from in our diet. The last two types of fats that I want to talk about are quite quick. So one is cholesterol and the other one is phospholipids. And then I have a summary chart at the end. Here we have a cholesterol molecule. Cholesterol is also composed of carbon-hydrogen bonds, but instead of being a long chain, they're folded into these cyclical structures. So cholesterol is still a hydrophobic molecule with lots of carbon and hydrogen bonds. Cholesterol has very different functions compared to triglycerides. So triglycerides are all about energy, storing energy under our skin, right? And eating our triglycerides in our diet, our plants and our animal fats. Cholesterol has four main functions that are separate from producing energy. We don't use cholesterol to make energy. We use cholesterol to make cell membranes. We use cholesterol to make bile. Bile is a substance made by the liver that helps us digest fats. We use cholesterol to make transport molecules called LDLs and HDLs, and they help to move fats through our bloodstream. Our blood is made of water. Fats and water don't like each other, so HDLs and LDLs help to move fats through the bloodstream. And lastly, we use cholesterol to make hormones, specifically called steroid hormones. And these are hormones like testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so cholesterol has very important functions. We want to have cholesterol. So what about dietary cholesterol? A lot of people say, I have high blood cholesterol. Blood cholesterol is different from this molecule. This cholesterol molecule is a very healthy fat that has those functions that I just discussed. Blood cholesterol are the LDLs and HDLs, and they are combinations of different fats and proteins. LDLs are associated with heart disease because it indicates that you're consuming or storing more fat than you're burning. LDLs are not the same as a cholesterol molecule. And lastly, the last fat that I want to talk about is phospholipids. Phospholipids have a very important role in building our cell membranes. Our trillions of cells have to have a barrier that protects them from molecules just randomly moving in and moving out. So we're going to have a video about cells and how they're structured and how they function in another time. Phospholipids are composed of two fatty acid tails, two, and they are hydrophobic. These are carbon-hydrogen bonds. Each of these little points is a carbon. And sometimes the tails or these fatty acid chains will be saturated, and sometimes they will be unsaturated. When they are unsaturated, they bend, and therefore they are liquid. So these molecules are liquid like oil. Our cell membranes are basically more like olive oil compared to butter, right? Cell membranes have two fatty acid tails and a phosphate. So a phospholipid has a phosphate group. There's some other structures, some other molecular structures within this sort of head portion of a phospholipid. We have choline and we have glycerol and phosphate. The top part of the phospholipid, we call it the head, and it is hydrophilic. So this part of the phospholipid is going to like water. And this part of the phospholipid is not. It is like oil. So part of it is hydrophilic and part of it is hydrophobic. And this is super important because when we put them together, we end up with a cell membrane structure. A cell membrane is composed of two layers of phospholipids. The head portion that likes water is on the outside or the inside, and the tail portion that is hydrophobic points in. We can see cholesterol molecules in our cell membrane. We have proteins. So phospholipids are the primary fat that makes up our cell membranes. Okay, last thing, I have a summary chart. This will conclude or show you all of the different fats that we talked about today.